The rain always seems to fall harder in Modesto, especially on nights like that December evening in 2002. The relentless tapping on the pavement drowned out the world, leaving only the steady beat of your heart and the echo of things left unsaid. I was in my office, surrounded by the clutter of too many years chasing shadows. The smoke hung thick in the air as I lit another cigarette. It was late. Too late for anything but trouble. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Detective Brocchini, a good cop trying to stay afloat in a town swallowed by the tide. No pleasantries, just the facts. A young, pregnant woman was missing. 8 months along. Her name was Laci Peterson. I stubbed out the cigarette, grabbed my hat, and headed for the door. I've seen plenty of lost souls, but this one twisted in my gut. Maybe it was the time of year, the holiday decorations mocking the darkness that had settled over Modesto. Or maybe it was the slight falter in Brocchini's voice. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a descent into human depravity. As I stepped into the rain, the cold wind slapped my face. A harsh reminder that this world, for all its bright lights, was still dark and unforgiving. Laci Peterson was out there somewhere, and it was up to me to find her. But deep down, I knew how this story would end, and it wouldn't be a happy one. Act 1. The Disappearance. The call came as the rain let up, leaving Modesto's streets glistening under dim streetlights. A young woman, 8 months pregnant, had vanished from her home on Covina Avenue. Laci Peterson. The name echoed in my mind as I pulled on my trench coat and stepped into the night. When I arrived at the Peterson home, it stood dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the festive lights that still clung to the neighboring houses. Christmas lights twinkled in the distance, but here there was only silence and the faint hum of a television left on in the next room. The street was deserted, save for a lone dog barking in the distance, a golden retriever with a forlorn expression that seemed to match the mood of the entire neighborhood. The front door creaked open, and Scott Peterson stood in the dimly lit hallway. He looked the part of the grieving husband, disheveled, weary, with the faint scent of cologne trying to mask the stale air. But something was off. His eyes were too calm, too controlled for a man whose world had just crumbled. "Detective Rayne," I introduced myself. He nodded and stepped aside to let me in. The house was tidy, almost unnaturally so. No signs of a struggle, no hurried mess of a woman packing to leave in the dead of night. Just an eerie calm that set my instincts on edge. Scott led me into the living room, where he sank into an armchair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Family photos lined the mantel, happy memories frozen in time. But there was no warmth here, only the cold precision of someone trying too hard to appear normal. He began to speak, recounting the day's events in a flat, measured tone. Laci had been home when he left that morning, he said. She planned to walk the dog, bake cookies, maybe watch some TV. A regular day by all accounts. Except she never showed up at the park, and when he returned that afternoon, she was gone. No note, no sign of where she might have gone. I listened closely, watching him as he spoke. His words were carefully chosen, almost rehearsed. He said he'd been fishing at the Berkeley Marina, an alibi that sounded just a bit too convenient. And then there was the dog, found wandering the streets with its leash still attached. Something wasn't right. Scott's eyes flicked toward the window as he finished his story, searching for an escape from the questions he knew were coming. But I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easy. I pressed him on the details, probing for cracks in his story, but he remained cool, almost detached. Too cool. As I stood to leave, I paused in the doorway. "Mr. Peterson," I said, "if there's anything you're not telling me, now's the time to do it." He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I've told you everything, Detective," he replied, voice steady. But I couldn't shake the feeling he was holding something back. Maybe it was the way his eyes never quite met mine, or how his story fit together a little too neatly. Laci Peterson hadn't just disappeared. She'd been erased, and the man sitting in that living room chair knew more than he was letting on. Act 2. The Investigation. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and late nights spent poring over files in my dimly lit office. The rain hadn't let up. It never does in this town. Scott Peterson's alibi was the first thread I pulled on. Fishing at the Berkeley Marina. An innocent enough story, but the more I dug, the less it held together. He claimed he left early to catch the morning bite, but the weather was rough, and sturgeon weren't biting that time of year. I checked the logs, talked to the harbor master, even visited local bait shops. No one remembered seeing Scott that morning. The more I pressed, the more his story began to unravel. But it wasn't just the holes in his alibi. It was the life he lived behind the scenes, the one that didn't make it into the family photos. The name Amber Frey surfaced quickly, whispered by those who knew the Petersons better than they let on. A young, pretty massage therapist from Fresno, completely unaware that the man she was seeing was married, and soon to be a father. I remember speaking with Amber for the first time. She was nervous, her voice trembling slightly. But there was a strength there too, a determination to do the right thing. She'd been duped, used as a pawn in Scott's twisted game, but she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She agreed to cooperate, allowing us to record their conversations. What those tapes revealed turned the case on its head. Scott had lied to Amber, told her he was single, and even claimed he'd lost his wife. "This will be my first Christmas without her," he told her, 2 weeks before Laci went missing. The implications were clear. This wasn't just a man hiding an affair. This was a man planning a life without his wife and unborn child. The case exploded from there. What started as a quiet investigation became a full-blown media circus. Reporters swarmed Modesto like vultures waiting for the next scandal. Every move Scott made was scrutinized, every word dissected. The headlines were relentless, calling him a monster, a cold-blooded killer. While the press played judge and jury, I was left to sift through the wreckage, separating fact from fiction. But the spotlight wasn't just on Scott, it was on me too. Every time I stepped out of the precinct, there were cameras flashing, microphones shoved in my face. They wanted a villain, and Scott fit the bill perfectly. But I couldn't let the noise drown out the facts. I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford to be distracted by the circus playing out on the nightly news. As the days turned into weeks, the evidence against Scott piled up. The lies, the affairs, the cold, calculated way he covered his tracks, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, meticulously planned, and heartlessly executed. Yet there was still a piece of the puzzle missing, a clear motive that would tie it all together. Why would a man with so much to lose throw it all away? Was it the pressure of impending fatherhood, the thrill of a new romance, or something darker buried deep within? As I sat in my office staring at the board covered in notes and photographs, the faces of Laci and her unborn child staring back at me, I knew the answers were out there. I just had to dig deeper, push harder, and hope the truth would reveal itself before it was too late. But one thing was certain. Scott Peterson wasn't the man he pretended to be. In a town like Modesto, where secrets fester in the dark, that kind of deception only leads to one thing: the cold, hard hand of justice. Act 3. The Discovery. The wind was harsh on the shores of San Francisco Bay that April day, whipping through the tall grasses and carrying the salt-tinged scent of the sea. The sun struggled to break through thick clouds, casting the scene in a bleak gray light. When the call came in, it felt like time stopped. A couple walking their dog had found something in the marshes near Point Isabel, a body or what was left of one. I drove out there, the pit in my stomach growing with each mile. Deep down, I knew what I was about to see, but knowing didn't make it any easier. The body was almost unrecognizable, ravaged by water and the elements, but the signs were there, remnants of a woman. pregnant, just like Laci had been. A mile down the shore, they found another, a tiny, fragile body. The scene was almost too much to bear, even for someone hardened by years of staring into the abyss. This was the end of a life that hadn't even begun. As I stood there staring at the remains, I couldn't help but think how wrong this all was. Laci and her son should have been at home, safe and warm. Instead, they'd been discarded, left to the mercy of the bay. The autopsies confirmed what we feared. The bodies were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The pathologist's report was grim: 2 cracked ribs on Laci, the fetus expelled from her body post-mortem, the umbilical cord torn, not cut. The worst part was the nylon tape found around the baby's neck, a chilling detail that told you this wasn't just murder. This was something darker. The evidence against Scott had been mounting for weeks, but this was the final nail in the coffin. It was no longer just suspicion. It was fact. He'd killed his wife, their unborn son, and tried to cover it up with the calm detachment of a man who thought he could get away with it. Scott's arrest came as no surprise, but that didn't make the moment any less significant. It happened on a sunny afternoon in La Jolla, far from the rain-soaked streets of Modesto. He was driving his Mercedes, the car stuffed with camping gear, survival supplies, and nearly $15,000 in cash. His hair was bleached blonde, a poor attempt at a disguise, and he carried his brother's license as well as his own. He was running, or at least he thought he was. When the officers pulled him over, Scott didn't resist. He just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, as if he knew the game was up. I wasn't there to see it, but I pictured it 1,000 times. Scott Peterson, the man who lied, cheated, and murdered, brought down by the weight of his own guilt. The trial that followed was a circus, a spectacle that brought out the worst in people. The media had a field day, the public couldn't get enough, and Scott sat through it all with the same cold detachment that defined him from the start. But in the end, the jury saw through it. They saw him for what he was, a man who had taken everything good in his life and destroyed it. They found him guilty. As I stood outside the courthouse on that final day, watching the crowds disperse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a deep sadness. There was no joy in seeing Scott Peterson go down, no satisfaction in watching him be led away in handcuffs. Because at the end of the day, there were no winners here. Laci and Connor were still gone, their lives snuffed out before they began. Justice had been served, but it was a cold, hollow victory. The kind that leaves you staring into the darkness, wondering how a man could be so empty, so devoid of humanity, that he would do something like this. As I lit a cigarette, the rain starting to fall again, I knew this case, this tragedy, would haunt me for the rest of my days. In a world like this, there are no happy endings, only the cold, hard truth and the hope that somehow, somewhere, it makes a difference. But for Laci and Connor, that difference came too late. And for Scott Peterson, it would come in the form of a life spent behind bars, where he would have nothing but time to think about the lives he destroyed.